We are going to begin our discussion today on Ukraine, Russia, the G7, NATO, and what we should all be doing with the words of General Rick Hillier. And I'm quoting him here. If platitudes were air defense missiles, if praise was anti-tank rockets, applause was fighters, and wishes and prayers were weapons, Ukrainian President Zelensky would have been able to plan his country's victory parade over Russia. Sadly, what was on display, and he was referring to our country, was Canada's unrelenting drive to provide Ukraine with complete assistance short of real help. More pallets of platitudes being airlifted to Ukraine. We have gathered together some very smart minds today to wrestle this issue. We are watching the G7 and NATO and the European Union all meet and discuss and talk. There are a few new promises, but let's take a look at the state of play and where we are today. Let me introduce first Admiral Mark Norman. He is the reason we're gathered here today. He was on our podcast just last week and said, let's broaden the picture out and look not only at where we are, but where we might be going and what the end games look like in this. Of course, 40 years of service to his country in the Royal Canadian Navy, and became Vice Chief of the Defense Staff before he retired. It's a real pleasure to have you back, Admiral Norman. Thank you so much. A longtime friend and colleague, Hugh Segal, is with us today, former chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, former chair of the NATO Association of Canada, and co-chair of the Democracy 10 Street Council. This is based in Washington, a grouping of the 10 largest democracies. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Also joining us, Marcus Kolga, a writer, a communications strategist, an expert on Russian and European foreign policy, a consultant specializing in digital strategic communications, and a senior fellow for foreign policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It's quite a set of credentials. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for being here today. Let's just start, Admiral Norman, with you. If you're looking at where we sit today from the last time we spoke, what has changed? Is it better or worse?
Well, it's certainly worse for the Ukrainian people. In terms of the military campaign, it's worse for the Russians than when we last spoke. Certainly, the Ukrainians still continue to demonstrate incredible both capacity and tenacity in terms of basically holding the Russians at bay to the extent that they can. We discussed the last time, there's no denying the mass of the Russian capability, the overmatch in terms of some of the weaponry, and obviously the Russians continue to escalate, I think in part because of the frustration that they're experiencing day to day, hour to hour on the ground. So from that perspective, the situation is worse, but it is demonstrating that the Ukrainians are holding out much more capably than even some of the most optimistic estimates would have given us a week or two ago. We're seeing. Go ahead. And we're seeing this expand. We've seen clear indications of attacks in the western part of Ukraine, demonstrations by Russia that NATO needs to be very careful, particularly in that humanitarian corridor out of Poland. And we're seeing some increased activity along the Black Sea, particularly in some of the coastal areas. In that regard. So, there's lots more, but that's my sort of macro view.
As we also discussed last time, and I'm always torn on this one because it is true, and we say it over and over again, that the extraordinary bravery and character of Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are a beacon, are amazing to all of us. But on the other hand, that somehow lets us off the hook a little bit, which, boy, they're doing such a good job, and we're still having a lot of meetings about what we should be doing. Hugh, bravery is not an indication of victory. Is there more we should be doing?
Well, let me just disagree with you, Senator. I don't think that what they have done, the Ukrainians, both their military and the militias and the others, in slowing down the Russian advance, actually lets us off the hook. It makes the hook larger on which we find ourselves, because it says to us that we have a duty as members of NATO and as part of a global community that abhors everything the Russians are doing, to find substantive ways to step up and aid the Ukrainians. And what our former chief of defense staff said, and what you quoted him as saying, is correct. And part of the problem, of course, is because the Americans are determined not to actually engage in Ukraine, in defense of Ukraine, because it's not a NATO country. Mm-hmm. And countries like Canada, and I don't actually blame the present Minister of Defense or even the present Prime Minister for this. It's not their fault that the armed forces that we have in this country are radically too small for a country our size, radically short of the necessary materiel to be a meaningful contributor. So the lack of will on the part of NATO to engage, and the lack of the capacity of Canada to have, with what we might engage in sufficient quantity, really reduces our ability. But that doesn't get us off the hook. It just forces, I think, on us and on the government of Canada to step up and begin to make the kinds of substantive expenditures that allow us to help Ukraine and the free world get off the hook, and make it perfectly clear to the Russians there's a limit to how far they can go. But even if they came up and they said, we're going to double the money from 1.46% to 3%, you need a plan for how you're going to spend it in a way that makes a difference now. And that's,
you need about 10 or 20 years to get the equipment you need. That was my only point, is that we knew this invasion was coming in some form or another. And if we needed any other signal at all, it's Xi and Putin standing at the Olympics saying, just hold off till the closing ceremonies and then have at it. Marcus, I want to hear from you, because again, this week and last week, all of the gatherings of the nations, of course they have intent in their hearts, but we actually need to do something pretty quickly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And just to go back to the point about the bravery of the Ukrainians, they are doing an incredible job. President Zelensky has really galvanized his people. His communications have been brilliant. The expectation was, let's not forget, just 4 weeks ago, was that Kiev was supposed to fall in 3 to 4 days.
Yeah,
we're 4 weeks in, and the Ukrainian army in certain places north of Kiev is going on the offensive. And I would, completely agree with Mr. Siegel insofar as, are we off the hook? No, we're not off the hook. We are on the hook. They need our help more than ever. So if we look to the north and the success that the Ukrainians are having there, we need to also look to the south, to Mariupol. This is a city of 450,000 people that has been completely decimated by indiscriminate Russian shelling. Cruise missiles. We saw images this morning of cruise missiles flying from Russian ships in the Black Sea into Mariupol. There are tens of thousands of people that are stuck in that city. They have no food. They have no water. So the question for NATO right now really should be, where's that red line? When do we act to ensure, at the very least, that those refugees who are stuck and are going to die, if we do not help them in the next 24 to 48 hours, how do we help them get out? How do we protect them? We've already seen that Vladimir Putin is more than happy to kill any civilians that he sees on the roads, regardless of any agreements that he has. So I think that we need to, that NATO needs to start stepping up in that regard. And certainly with regards to what's going on in the north, we need to send more weapons. I know that Canada has, if we look into our own stocks, I mean, we don't have much left to give.
The cupboard is bare. Yeah,
the cupboard is bare, but our allies do have weapons to give. We have funds. We can help backfill any weapons that our allies give to Ukraine. But now is the time to put maximum effort on supplying the Ukrainians so that they can continue bravely defending their country and hopefully expand on the successes they've had so far.
Okay, let's go around on the whole question, because I think it's succinctly put of the red line. Like, at what point is it so serious? I mean, I don't even know that we can just refer to this as an invasion or even a war. This is looking like some kind of murderous rampage that this guy is on, and that we need to, the humanitarian question is huge. I think we've all raised this question about, air defense, and that NATO doesn't want to go in and provide planes, but we could have done the deal with Poland by allowing them to send the MiGs in, their planes in, and then have the Americans replace. Or we could have air cover over some kind of humanitarian corridor. There is the right to protect. That's a well-established principle. Admiral Norman, has your view on that changed? What's the red line that's emerging?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I heard some discussion today about the possible threat. Again, it's not the first time, of escalation on the part of the Russians into the domain of chemical or weapons of mass destruction, and that starts. And some of the language I heard was to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, that that changes the game, and that will be very interesting. I'm not sure the Russians are prepared to go there. Not just because some folks in NATO might have voiced concern, but more that even they realize that might be a step too far. But who knows? And I don't want to use that loosely, because this is very dangerous territory. Obviously, I think the humanitarian situation that Marcus was describing. It'll be very interesting to see the extent to which public opinion in the West decides whether there's a line or not, and whether they'll know where that line is before it gets crossed, or whether they will reach a point where people start to say, like, why, along the lines of General Hillier's comment, like, why aren't we doing anything? I think, to go back to our previous conversation, a red line has already been crossed, and we screwed it up, to put it bluntly, which is when we made statements to the effect that the West was not going to interfere.
Yeah. No boot on the ground, no plane in the air.
Exactly. And you and I discussed previously the deterrent component of this, and the West is now being deterred. So the question then becomes, what is sufficient for the West to decide that the situation has changed and they need to do something, and then what is it? The no-fly zone, in my opinion, continues to be a very powerful example of the frustration on both sides of this debate. And from a military perspective, there's no gray zones to this. You're either in or you're not, and it doesn't matter where you draw the line. It's a very dangerous situation, but it is still a feasible scenario, especially in the context of a humanitarian situation, and especially when we look at the fragility of that resupply corridor that is so essential to the Ukrainians maintaining the ability to fight. So that's my views.
Yeah, no, I think there were so many statements made. President Biden was talking about he would respond in kind to chemical warfare, and I know he misspoke himself. So everybody's now busy out there saying, no, we wouldn't respond to that, but we'd respond in some way. Hugh, just let's maybe stay focused on the humanitarian angle. Is there no precedent for going in and securing a humanitarian corridor, an exit to bring in, through under the auspices of the military, food, supplies, water, blood, whatever it may be that's needed?
Well, there is precedent. If you think about the war between Hezbollah and the Israelis, and there was a truce, a ceasefire established, and the UN sent in forces. Canada was amongst them. Actually, so were the Chinese, to police that proposition, deal with the humanitarian issues, and then we engaged as a country to help those Lebanese of Canadian extraction exit the country and come home safely. And we had to deal, Mark and his colleagues had to deal with the Israeli Navy and others to make sure we had safe passage for the ferries on which we put those Canadians. So there's all kinds of precedent. And I think the real problem, and this is something which Mark referenced a few moments ago, we have let Putin set the initiative from the very beginning, and we have been in a reactionary response mode. My view is that when the United Nations General Assembly passes a motion that tells the Russians to stop the attack and withdraw their troops, and the only countries who vote against that motion are Russia, Syria, North Korea, and Belarus, there is a global consensus. And I don't think we should let the threat of nuclear war, which the Russians will throw around, remember what the Nazis threw around in World War II, what they were going to do with the V2 rockets and all. At some point, you have to say, we are not going to put up with this. We are going to engage, and the Russians will have to make their own decisions accordingly. Right. Because otherwise, however we try to get stuff through Poland and ship materials to be helpful, the bottom line is we cannot compete unless we engage with the massive size of the ordnance, rockets, and air capacity which Russia can deploy. And the Ukrainians have been so successful with the use of allied air defense missiles and the rest that most of the Russian planes firing those missiles into Ukraine are actually not doing it from Ukrainian airspace. They're avoiding Ukrainian airspace because the Ukrainians have become so effective at using what they have to shoot those planes and helicopters down. So at some point, we have to show some commitment here. Otherwise, how many more thousands of people in Ukraine going about their lives in their puffy jackets with their puppies and their kids have to die before we decide it's too much? And I think it's that point.
We are, Marcus, 1 month in. People, certainly in this group here and in other places, have been saying we must do something soon. Like, have we not hit soon?
Well, look, I've been arguing that we. Oh, am I muted? No, I'm not. I've been arguing, that we should have been doing something already in 2007 when Vladimir Putin tried to destabilize Estonia and engaged in the first ever state-sponsored cyber attacks against that country. The following year, he attacked Georgia. We should have been standing up to him then. We placed a few sanctions on him, but those sanctions were later lifted, and we were back to business as usual within a year or two. In 2014, Crimea, his forces, Vladimir Putin's own missile systems that he provided to the separatists in eastern Ukraine shot down a Malaysian airliner out of the air. We still did nothing. In 2016, we saw Vladimir Putin try to destabilize the United States presidential election to varying degrees of success, but you could argue that America is no longer the place it used to be before that election. We've allowed him to get away with this over and over and over again. And with the risk of oversimplifying it, but we're only going to stop Vladimir Putin when we stop him. And I completely agree with Hugh that now is the time. We need to put everything we have into Ukraine to make sure that Vladimir Putin isn't able to move further west, because if we allow him to move further west now in Ukraine, there's no telling where he's going to stop. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, they could all be next, and they could all be next tomorrow. And we have to assume the worst. We've talked about the nuclear threat. Is Vladimir Putin suicidal enough to start launching nuclear weapons at the West? I don't know. I don't think we can rule it out. One of the things I'm most concerned about right now is the use of chemical warfare. We've been warned by intelligence agencies, especially the United States, for the past 2 weeks that he may use them. I suspect that he may indeed use them in the next 48 to 72 hours. Is that the red line? I think we need to act now to prevent him from using those chemical weapons, because he's used them before. We saw him use them in Syria. I have no doubt that he's more than open to using them now in Ukraine, but we may be able to deter him if we stop him right now. So now is the moment to do that.
Okay, Mark, Admiral Norman, let's talk about what needs to happen. I mean, we're hearing all the world leaders say that this is unacceptable, that he must be stopped. Who can make the decision? Who can make that first move to say, okay, you know what, we're going in, to Hugh's point? He's going to threaten till the day he dies to use nuclear power. So either we cower in the corner, or we say, oh yeah, let's see. But who can do what tomorrow? Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, realistically, if we eliminate the possibility of any third party success to try and manage this, de-escalate, and those attempts are ongoing, and we see reports of them. So now we're dealing with a strictly military situation. I mean, ultimately, this has to be, well, it doesn't have to be, but a U.S.-led initiative. And we're talking about North Atlantic Council. We're talking about NATO all getting together and deciding, and that requires consensus. So, this is a very, sadly, notwithstanding the compelling arguments that are being presented here and elsewhere, this is a very unlikely situation. In the same way that the United Nations came as close to consensus as you could get, as Hugh described, the reality is NATO has to agree. And I just don't see 29 countries agreeing that this is the right thing to do. I think, so then it becomes a question of, well, is there a coalition of the willing? And we've seen those in the past. We've seen them operate under the sort of unofficial rubric of NATO structure, using NATO command and control capabilities and the like, predominantly US-led. Is there a coalition of countries who are prepared to do that? Are the key European countries prepared, for example, and I'm being theoretical here in response to your question, do France, Germany, the UK, and a few others say, okay, thank you, President Biden, for your continued support, but we're going to do something about this. Is it theoretically possible? Yeah. Is it likely? Probably not, just because there is such a dependence on many of the enablers that the U.S. would bring to the military requirement, even the no-fly zone. To try and do a no-fly zone properly without the U.S. would be extremely difficult. It could be done, but they certainly could make it a hell of a lot easier. So
Hugh, let's just explore that, the whole question of the coalition of the willing, because a lot of people are arguing, and again, it's not the presidents and the prime ministers, that the NATO's Section 5, Article 5 has been violated, that his threats to everybody in the region actually are a threat. And so therefore we could start to respond. Do you think that there are enough people around there that they could at least form, the coalition of the willing to gain some bargaining power with the Americans or with NATO as a whole?
So I'm going to pick up from your question and some elements of what Mark said a moment ago. I actually think that if you got what Mark called a coalition of the willing, and which made the following under the NATO alliance is not prepared to act because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Right. Got it? Message received. But there's a coalition of the willing that could involve the United Kingdom and France and Canada and Sweden and Norway and others who would have the ability, and they could call it an independent stabilization force, right? Not a peacekeeping force, a stabilization force. And how do you stabilize Ukraine? You go to Ukraine and you work with the Ukrainian armed forces to push the Russians out of the country. That's how you stabilize Ukraine. And if Putin, in response to that, goes back to his threat of nuclear this and nuclear that, have a good day. Because the bottom line is the credibility of his armed forces, the credibility of his command structure, the credibility of his non-existent, well-trained NCOs to actually manage in the field is zero. And thanks to the training work that was done by our armed forces, the British and the Americans, with the Ukrainians over the last many years, their operational ability, based on their own hard work and their own courage, is actually quite compelling. So I think that is a better option. Then once the stabilization force is in place, that may be a better rationale for a broader kind of negotiation where the Ukrainians aren't the last ones at the table. They actually have something to play with. And that would be the approach that I would think a Canadian Prime Minister who is trying to be creative and substantive and not just send plaudits and prayers would try to engage and advance, in my view.
So it would take some check writing. We're told today that the Russians are now refusing to answer at the high levels American phone calls. So that seems to have broken down pretty substantially, which even gives more weight to this notion of maybe some kind of coalition of the willing. I want to come back to Marcus, though, and have you bring in the question of China, that of course this couldn't have happened unless the Chinese signed off on it and gave Putin the right to go ahead. So what kind of force, if any, is there to bring to bear on that player?
Well, look, I think China was sold a completely different bill of goods with regards to Vladimir Putin's invasion. I suspect, and I think a lot of other experts believe, that Xi was told that Putin would take Donbass, he would move his troops into Donbass and declare those independent, have a sham referendum, and they would join Russia. I think what Xi was told was that the engagement would be limited. I don't think that they were prepared for what we're seeing today. I think that the Chinese government is concerned about what they're seeing right now happening in Ukraine. And I think their greatest concern is for the level of sanctions that have been slapped onto the Putin regime and the oligarchs. I think they're looking at those, and quite frankly, they are terrifying. The sanctions that we have placed on Russia, they threaten to completely paralyze the Russian economy, and I think this is of deep concern to Xi. And I think it's adjusted his own calculus when it comes to Taiwan, certainly the South China Sea, and its relations with the West.
I hope you're right. I just read a piece in The Economist that says that actually China is hoping that this is a humiliation for Russia and that they do lose, and whatever that means, because that leaves Xi as the singular most powerful person.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I think that President Xi actually regards Russia simply as China's gas station. I don't think he has any particular respect for Russia. And there's, of course, China is keeping its eye on Siberia. There have been concerns articulated that China may want to move into parts of Russia. So I'm sure that Xi is quite happy in that sense with what he's seeing with a weakened Russia.
Yeah, they're a different kind of friendship than we understand. Go ahead, Hugh.
I think the Chinese have shown quite a bit of restraint on this file in terms of what they're not in favor of, what they admit they were informed of. I think they're going out of their way to create some space within which they can maneuver, as Marcus has suggested, so they're not kind of tied to a ship that's going in the wrong direction at full speed, but they have some maneuverability, and I think that's to their credit, because whatever else you might say about the Chinese, economic domination and all those other things, and protecting the notion of them invading a neighboring country that had no military intent of attacking them. Imagine the Chinese invading Malaysia just because they could. I think that would offend the Chinese sense of sovereignty and what's appropriate. And I think that's in our interest in this process.
I want to go to the question that Marcus just touched on there about sanctions and take a look at that part of the puzzle. Despite all of the sanctions that are in place, I read as recently as this morning that Russia still is bringing in $1 billion a day with a B in oil revenues because Europe and other countries and China can't replace the sources or the supply that he provides. So as long as he's making $1 billion a day, he can afford to do this for quite a while, Mark Norman.
Well, okay, so there's an economic component to this, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, even though I studied it at Queen's decades ago. But I would, in avoiding the question, I just want to go back to a couple of things that both Hugh and Marcus said in the last round that I think for your viewers or listeners, just we need to pull on the threads or at least highlight them for a future discussion, perhaps. The first one is the Hugh's comment with respect to military action and what is currently, and I've described it as the overmatch, Russia versus Ukraine, which we're seeing is perhaps not quite the overmatch that many of us imagined. For a coalition or some intervention force to tip that balance militarily would not be that difficult. Okay. Now, politically and all of, let's just put aside the second and third order implications. But in terms of actually putting sufficient military capacity in the way of the Russians, it would take very little to tip the balance squarely in the favor of the Ukrainians, given everything that they've done and that they're capable of doing. What is the problem? The problem is this nuclear deterrent issue from the outset. I'll just park that and pause it, but I think it's an important point to weigh on. The other one is Marcus's point about some of these other players, and we talked about China specifically. Yeah. I personally believe that the absence of any significant intervention on the part of the other security United Nations Security Council members, India in particular, China and others, they're just sort of sitting and watching and waiting to see what happens, I think is really unfortunate. And I think it puts an unfair onus on Europe to try and sort this problem out, especially when we've got this NATO versus Russia scenario that Hugh described, and maybe we just need to sidestep the NATO part of that conversation. Now, back to your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. Yeah. So go to sanctions then.
Right. So, I mean, look, I'm not going to comment on the economic impact. There's much smarter people, but I can tell you his military capacity, as much as it is significant, is limited in the sense that it is not completely, a bottomless supply of people or capability. Sure, he's got lots of ammunition and they can move it around the country as they need to, but they're going through vehicles, aircraft, major pieces of equipment much faster than anybody thought they would, and that's due to enemy contact. Plus, they've got all of these well-reported logistical challenges and resupply challenges. Plus, they're dealing with a growing problem associated with people, reserves calling up, moving people around. We've got significant reports of desertion or near desertion. Arguably, there's some kind of purge going on inside the senior echelons of the Russian army. I mean, forget the sanctions and their direct impact economically. The ability to sustain this, I think, is somewhat questionable, despite my thoughts earlier in the starting days of the conflict.
Okay, so Marcus, I'll just come back to you then on the question of sanctions, which is, everybody's ratcheting them, a little by a little, and Is there some move by some player that would actually change the game, that would respond to what Mark just said, that there's going to be a tipping point for the Russians because their military's in trouble and he doesn't have an endless source of tax base, but even though he's got some good oil revenues.
Yeah, so I think Mark painted an extremely accurate picture of the Russian situation. It's a disaster in every sense. Morale is down. Vladimir Putin is really relying on his disinformation machine in order to ensure that his people continue supporting, not only supporting the war, but that they don't eventually rise up. Because we're hearing reports as well of some of these recruits, these reservists who come to the front, and they had no idea what they're getting into because they've been told that this is a very special, limited operation that is targeting the Nazi government that is running Ukraine, the denazification campaign. And when they get to the front, they're seeing the mass slaughter of civilians, this destruction of entire cities. And that's causing a real problem for morale. And some of these reports through these recruits are obviously trickling back into Russia, which has been otherwise hermetically sealed off from the truth that we understand. And so it's a real problem. And now if you combine the sanctions into all of this, are they having an effect right now? It's hard to tell. I think the sectoral sanctions, the fact that these companies, Western companies, have all pulled out of Russia, I think regular Russians are going to start feeling that soon. The fact that Russians can't go out and get their Big Mac is going to affect them shortly. The other problem with that is that it is limited to big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's not Russia. That's a limited part of Russia. Russia is a huge country. And so that won't necessarily affect Russians all that broadly. Where the sanctions are having a real impact are on the oligarchs, the corrupt oligarchs that enable Vladimir Putin. Many of these oligarchs are said to hold Vladimir Putin's own personal wealth. And Vladimir Putin relies on them to maintain his power. The rest of that, he requires the security apparatus to hold on to power. But we are hearing that there are oligarchs who are starting to peel off from supporting Putin. There are some who have posted anti-war messages on their social media platforms. And just yesterday, we heard that President Zelensky himself suggested to the United States that they not place sanctions on Roman Abramovich. Roman Abramovich is, of course, the former owner of Chelsea Football Club, and probably the one oligarch who is closest to Vladimir Putin. It's said that he actually nominated Vladimir Putin to succeed Boris Yeltsin. And so Zelensky has suggested that perhaps Roman Abramovich would be a key person in negotiating at least a ceasefire, perhaps a truce between the two sides. And I fully believe that it is sanctions that will motivate Mr. Abramovich to do the right thing. There's no reason to believe that he would have done so before this, but that's the point of the sanctions, is that they are intended to change the behavior of those inside Vladimir Putin's inner circle. And we'll have to see if it has that effect. But if Roman Abramovich is used to bring at least a ceasefire, momentary ceasefire, I think that's one sign that these sanctions are working on the oligarchs.
Yeah, and the sanctions are going to start to affect us as well, as the leaders have been talking about. Russia and Ukraine provide 30% of the wheat, barley. Russia's a big fertilizer supplier, all of those things too. So let me turn our attention, if I can, for the next few minutes to, the domestic front. It's not about us, but it is about us in terms of us being a player. Melanie Joly says we're a convener nation. That's all we should do. We have no ability to do anything else. Anita Nan, cupboard is bare. Prime Minister says our foreign policy is cheering for the underdog, which is questionable. I know certainly in the Jewish community, responding to that, saying, what does that mean about his position on Palestinians, etc. Where are we? What have we learned in the last month about what Canadian foreign policy is and when we're prepared to stand up and when we're not? Mr. Siegel, I'm going to dump that on your lap to start.
So I don't think it's accurate to ask what have we learned? I think it's more accurate to ask, what are we learning through this process now? And I would say, you think about ministers like Anita Anand, Minister of National Defense, the new foreign minister. They, I think, have found themselves in a circumstance utterly unpredictable when they took their oath of office and loyalty to Her Majesty the Queen, become a member of the Privy Council. And I think they have actually shown a fair amount of acuity and intellectual engagement, and they've shown some leadership. And I think particularly of Minister Anand, who, is a very down-to-earth professor of law. Her specialization is governance and corporate responsibility. And I think she's been engaging directly in a fashion that says to the Department of National Defense, we now know what the problem is. We're going to work together to try to fix it in terms of putting the resources necessary into your hands as soon as possible. And I think that will affect our budget. I suspect that term about being a convener nation was something in Minister Jolly's briefing book. And if you think about the folks who write those briefing books at Global Affairs Canada, well, they have always been about soft power. As Admiral Norman knows, anytime there was two options, a diplomatic soft power option, or maybe the responsible deployment of forces to make something happen efficiently, Global Affairs Canada would not be for the deploying of the forces. They never wanted the forces to get involved in the safe evacuation of Canadians of Lebanese extraction who wanted to come home during the Hezbollah-Israeli war.
Or Afghanistan, we might throw into that discussion about what a hell of a job we did there. Yeah,
well, that's right. And without the forces having deployed to manage the crowd and all that stuff, which Canadian forces are trained to do, we would still have 15,000 Canadians of Lebanese extraction who wanted to leave Lebanon and couldn't. So I think they're adapting. I think they're adapting relatively responsibly, but I think they're dealing with a deficit in capacity, ability, and linkage, which they've inherited from a whole bunch of other governments of all persuasions over the last 25 years. And now the issue will be, how quickly do they actually reorient the ship, in a sense, pick a new path, and define it clearly. And if they do that, then that will be something which is in everybody's interest. And if they don't, they will become part of the problem very, very quickly.
But Hugh, you're being generous on that score. It's not like Mr. Trudeau came to office yesterday. He's been there for many years now. So if there was going to be an indication, and what a lot of people are looking at today is the new arrangement with the NDP and what that might mean for any increase in defense spending in this upcoming budget.
But to be fair, the NDP didn't miss a beat by saying we are absolutely not opposed to significant military expenditure because we're getting what we think we need on Dentacare and pharmacare for low-income Canadians. So their position is not unrealistic. And if you think, Pam, about David Lewis and Pierre Trudeau and the 2 years during which all they did was create Petro-Canada, for example, and various other things which would not be center-right creations, if you think about the relationship that existed between Bill Davis and the two opposition leaders during his minority government periods between 75 and 81. So those kinds of relationships have existed. Same thing in BC between the Greens and the NDP. The New Brunswick Premier had to get support from the New Brunswick Party to form a government. So I don't think there's anything particularly new about that. But the fact that they have both said that the fact that we are facing a possibility of a generalized European war is another reason to choose stability, I think is actually quite responsible. And if you think about what happened in World War II, we had a coalition government, and that's what we did in this country. And so I'm not troubled by that at all. I think it's actually a step in the right direction.
Mark, I want to come to you on this question of, because it's even, we know the cupboard is bare, and we know that you don't just go to Walmart and pick out some, missile launchers or new F-35s, right? That this is a long, complicated process. So if we take Hugh's optimism about this, that the spending increases will begin and that there will be a focus on defense for the first time in 6-7 years. What does that mean in timing in terms of getting new equipment on board? It's a slow process.
Yeah, it is. And I think I go back, if I could, I'd just like to react to Hugh's characterization because I think there's a couple of important takeaways here at the strategic level before we talk about defense spending specifically.
Mm,
The first one is, the realization that it's great to have ideology related to the world that we'd all like to live in, but the practicality of having to deal with the world that we're actually living in is a stark lesson for anybody. If you're not used to having to deal with some of the ugly practicalities that we've been discussing for the last 40 minutes or so. The second, I think, significant takeaway here, and I'm glad to see it starting to come out of these national discussions, is we don't need to be debating breads versus butter, butter versus guns, or all these,
yeah.
because, within limits, we are a wealthy nation that has responsibilities with respect to how wealthy we really are. And juxtaposing fighter jets with dental care is an unhelpful characterization. And the fact that we have the leader of the NDP saying, no, look, as long as we're getting this stuff, I'm okay with this stuff, I think is encouraging, not just in the short term, but I'm hopeful, perhaps naively so, that it starts to frame, I think, a more sophisticated conversation as we go forward. To your specific point, there are probably four ways money is spent in defense, and the focus tends to be on the big shiny objects and the shopping lists, okay? But there are other key components of what makes up an armed force. There's the people component of this, where we're woefully short of people, and that includes not just the numbers, but how many we have in certain roles, how they're trained, all those types of things. There's a readiness component to this from a material perspective, which relates to why the cupboards are bare, how the fleets that we have in service are being supported or not supported. And those are areas in which you can start to have a more potentially immediate or near immediate impact. There are unimaginable pressures on every dimension of the defense budget, not just the capital program. And so, but sadly, the biggest challenge in all of this is a combination of a lack of capacity inside the machinery of government to actually move whatever money gets approved. And this is why I am fearful that, notwithstanding what enthusiasm there might be about a whole bunch of new announcements, if we don't actually improve the ability to deliver on those promises, we're going to be no better off 1, 3, or 7 years from now. And then the other one is a process discussion that I don't want to get into today, but it is unhelpful to this ability to actually move program. But there are ways, there can be some near-term improvement, but you can't turn this ship on a dime, so to speak.
Yeah, the procurement process itself, I think, is just, it's cited by so many people as the biggest obstruction in, and it's not just for planes and shiny objects. We're talking about computers for offices, or the ability to govern, for the government to operate on Zoom. Like,
Or
you
even
can't
put
procure
it,
anything.
right, or even put recruiting ads on television.
Yeah.
I mean, it's stagnant in so many respects.
Hugh made an interesting observation about this generation of leaders in our country having to deal with this. Most of our ministers on this file are in their 40s and 50s. This is not an issue that they have, it's not real in their minds, and they're getting a huge, quick education on this. Seeing Mr. Zelensky, the president, sort of really step up. I guess what I'm looking for is some kind of silver lining in all of this, that there is going to be another generation now coming up who's got some experience with this. It isn't World War II. It's not even Afghanistan. This is now really putting stuff on the table that they have to crunch. That's difficult, Marcus.
Look, I think one of the lessons that we thankfully learned over the past four weeks is that Vladimir Putin and other authoritarians like him are killers. They threaten the stability of not just those countries around them, but of the Western liberal order, of democracies around the world. And I think we finally come to the realization that that's the threat that he represents. And for Canadians, I think that we have to start looking further, not just from beyond Ukraine, and recognize the kinds of other threats that Putin poses. The Arctic, for example. I've been warning Canadians that Vladimir Putin has, over the past 10 years, engaged in a rapid militarization of the Arctic region. Yep. He's created these absolutely insane super weapons for the Arctic. There's a high-speed underwater nuclear torpedo. But why would you need something like that to defend your country? This is a weapon that's intended to hit coastlines like our Arctic coastline and irradiate it for 10,000 or more years. And when you couple this rapid militarization, there's 26 new bases that he's built over the past 10 years. Vladimir Putin put in a claim to the UN for all of the resources underneath the Arctic Sea just last summer.
Yep.
And this is part of his, he's not hiding this. The Russian government has clearly declared that resource imperialism is an official doctrine of that government. So when you combine it with the militarization, this resource imperialism, there's a real threat to our Arctic, because that claim underneath the Arctic Sea comes right up to our 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So, I'm hoping that over the past 4 weeks, the Canadian government truly has woken up to this threat and will start taking it seriously with regards to national defense and our foreign policy.
Yeah, and maybe putting some balance into our policies. The green at any cost. Now if you're going to be an international player, you've got to make a contribution, and we've got contributions to make with supplying energy and those kinds of questions. Exactly. Gentlemen, this has just been amazing. We're almost at an hour, so I think I'm going to wrap it up soon. But I would love to come back to this, and I hope we're still not at this point in 2 weeks from now. But we'll see how this works out. I think I'll take 20 seconds from each of you on this, which is, Hugh, we'll start with you. Where do you think we are going to be? Do you think we're close?
So the real question is, what does a democracy like Canada, a middle power, do to make a difference? So the result is one where Ukraine survives, the war stops, and there's no further aggression by Putin. And the answer is, we stay the course in supporting Ukraine, and we think of ways to strengthen the military presence on the ground through a coalition of the willing. So we send a strong message to Putin: you may have other countries to invade, better give up on Ukraine, because the Western world isn't going to let it happen. And the more we do that, and the more determined we are, the more likely we are to stop this guy before he puts one more puck in the net.
Mark Norman.
I think Hugh really summed it up. I continue to be very concerned about what's happening on the ground, so to speak, notwithstanding this great strategic discussion. I don't see this getting better in the short term. I fear that the Russians are going to continue to devastate and terrorize the population of Ukraine. I hope that the West will continue to find innovative ways. I have been frustrated by how stuck we have appeared in many respects. I am very concerned about the corridor in the west of Ukraine and its vulnerability, because it really is the lifeline for the Ukrainian people to to the rest of the world. And as far as the things that we're observing and that I think we need to very seriously talk about, well, I look forward to another discussion if I get invited back. Thanks.
You will. Oh, you will. Just a quick final thought then, Marcus.
Well, look, I think we need to stop Vladimir Putin, and I agree with everything that Hugh and Mark have said, but we also need to defeat him. Let's not forget, and this is a scary thought, that Vladimir Putin last summer changed the constitution of his country, and that will allow him to remain in power until 2036. There is no reason to believe that he will even leave office then. So we have decades of this. If he remains in power, there is decades of this left, and we have to deal with it. We have to deal with it as a nation and with our allies if he is to remain in power. Hopefully, he won't be in power that long, but if he is, we're in real trouble.
Not just stop him, defeat him. I think that's a very good end point. Thank you very much. Marcus Kolga, writer, communications strategist, expert, Russian, European foreign policy, and a senior fellow for foreign policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you very much. Admiral Mark Norman, 40 years of service to his country and continuing to do so. Thank you very much, the former vice chair of the defense staff. And Hugh Siegel, I'm going to leave it because there's a book sitting here right in front of me. I'll grab it if I can, called Two Freedoms, Freedom from Want, Freedom from Fear, written by one Hugh Segal. And I think that's what we're talking about here with what our commitment and responsibility is to Ukraine to ensure there is freedom from want and freedom from fear for all of us. Hugh Segal, thank you. Gentlemen, we'll talk again soon, and thank you so much for your contribution today. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Muller.